Her blind date on Christmas Eve, the unlucky single mother arrived late, but the billionaire waited anyway and was surprised. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The shrill sound of the alarm clock echoed through the small room at 5 in the morning. Sarah Johnson opened her heavy eyes, still foggy from another night of poor sleep. At 32, she had learned to live in a constant state of alert, always calculating every minute, every dollar, every movement. Her two-room apartment in Brooklyn was too small for two people, but it was what she could afford with the money from selling homemade treats and the cleaning jobs she did 3 times a week in the Upper East Side. "Mom, is it time to wake up yet?" The sleepy voice of Jake, her 8-year-old son, came from the mattress next to her bed. The boy had curly brown hair just like hers and dark eyes that sparkled with a precocious intelligence, forged by the need to grow up too fast. "Not yet, sweetheart. Go back to sleep for a little while," Sarah whispered, gently running her hand through her son's hair. It was Christmas Eve, and she had a special order to deliver: 15 carrot cakes with chocolate frosting for a children's party in the Upper East Side. The money from this sale would pay for Jake's Christmas gift, a used bicycle she had seen at a thrift store. By 6 o'clock, Sarah was already in the small kitchen, apron tied around her waist and hands covered in flour. The aroma of cinnamon and vanilla began to fill the air as she mixed the batter in the borrowed blender from her neighbor. Mrs. Thompson, a 68-year-old woman who lived alone in the apartment next door, had become more than just a neighbor. She was the family Sarah never had. "Sarah, dear, what time have you been up since?" Mrs. Thompson appeared at the door with a steaming cup of coffee. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore the floral robe that Sarah had known for 3 years. "Since 5, Mrs. T. I need to deliver these cakes by noon, and I still have to get ready for that date Emily set up." Sarah sighed, stirring the batter vigorously. The truth was, she didn't want to go. Blind dates never worked out, and they always ended with her feeling out of place and inadequate. "Ah, the famous date," Mrs. Thompson smiled mischievously. "Emily said he's an important businessman. Who knows? Maybe it's your turn to be happy, dear." Sarah laughed without humor. "Mrs. T, you know how it is. An important man doesn't want to know about a woman like me. A single mother, no money, living in a tiny apartment." She paused, looking around the small space she called home. "Besides, what man is going to want to wait for a woman who arrives late because she had to make cakes, to pay the bills?" "Sarah Johnson, I don't want to hear you talk about yourself like that." Mrs. Thompson's voice became firm. "You are a warrior, honest, hard-working woman. Any man who can't see that doesn't deserve you." On the other side of the city, in a penthouse in West Side, David Anderson, 38, watched the traffic on 5th Avenue through the window of his private office. Tall at 6'1", with slightly graying dark hair at the temples and piercing blue eyes, he was the kind of man who drew attention wherever he went. He wore an impeccable Armani suit, even though it was Saturday, a trait his employees knew well. "Mr. Anderson, the meeting with the Japanese investors has been moved to Monday, and Ms. Helena confirmed the reservation for 7 in the evening at the Grand Hotel." Carla, his personal assistant for 10 years, entered the office with a folder of documents. David nodded absently. Helena, a family acquaintance, had insisted he meet a special girl. Normally, he would decline. His schedule didn't allow for social outings without a business purpose. But something about that week had left him unsettled. Perhaps it was the approach of Christmas, or the call he received from the school informing him that his son, Ethan, 10 years old, had gotten into a fight defending a classmate who was being bullied for wearing old shoes. "Carla, do you have kids?" David asked suddenly. The woman in her 40s paused, surprised by the personal question. "I do, sir. 2 girls." "How do they see the world? I mean, what's important to them?" "Well," Carla hesitated, "they value honesty a lot, sir. And they don't care if their friend has the most expensive or the cheapest sneakers. What matters is if he's nice, shares his lunch, and helps when someone falls at recess." David fell silent for a few moments. Ethan attended an extremely expensive private school, but he had insisted on enrolling his son in a public school as an extracurricular activity, a way to keep him connected to reality. It was there that the boy met kids like Jake, who became his best friend despite the glaring social differences. At 5 in the afternoon, Sarah rushed home with the money from the cakes in her pocket. The afternoon had been hectic: delivery in the Upper East Side, bus ride home, an hour and a half of traffic, quick shower, and the terrible discovery that Mary, the babysitter who would take care of Jake, had a high fever. "Mom, are you nervous?" Jake observed as Sarah rummaged through the wardrobe looking for something presentable to wear. "A little, sweetheart. Mommy is going out, but Mrs. T will stay with you, okay?" "It's a date, right?" The boy smiled mischievously. "Ethan said his dad is always on dates, but never finds anyone nice." Sarah paused. Ethan was Jake's best friend, a polite boy who always brought extra snacks to share with the other kids. Her son. "Is Ethan's father a businessman?" "Yes. He works with very large numbers. Sometimes he picks Ethan up from school in a car that looks like a spaceship." A knot in her stomach made Sarah sit on the bed. Could it be too much of a coincidence? New York had millions of businessmen. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She chose a navy blue dress that Emily had lent her, applied some pink lipstick, and pulled her curly hair into a simple bun. At 6:15, she kissed Jake and rushed out. The bus was 20 minutes late. On the way, her straw bag tore, spilling her homemade beauty products on the floor of the bus. A beetroot gloss she made herself, an aloe vera moisturizer, and a handmade lavender perfume. The passengers helped her gather everything, but her confidence plummeted along with her belongings. At 8:10 in the evening, Sarah finally arrived at the Grand Hotel, a sophisticated restaurant in the Upper East Side with valet parking and tuxedoed receptionists. Her hands trembled as she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The dress was wrinkled from the rush. There was a small chocolate stain on her shoulder, a reminder of Jake's last hug, and her hair had partially escaped from the bun. She almost ran away. "Excuse me, are you looking for someone?" The maître approached with a professional smile. I'm late for a date. Reservation under Helen Carter." The man checked his list. "Ah, yes. He's been waiting for 2 hours but asked to keep the table reserved." 2 hours. Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment. What kind of man waits 2 hours for a stranger? Perhaps someone very desperate or very polite. David was sitting at a table in the corner of the restaurant near the windows, overlooking the illuminated garden. He had arrived at 6 sharp, as always. At 6:15, he concluded that he had been stood up. By 7, he considered leaving. By 8, he ordered a beer and decided to stay for another 30 minutes out of courtesy. Now, past 8 o'clock, he was still there. Why? He couldn't answer that himself. Perhaps it was the conversation with Ethan that morning. The boy had mentioned that his friend Jake was excited because his mother had finally agreed to go out with someone. "She never goes out, Dad. She works all the time to buy me things." The innocence in the boy's voice had touched David in an unexpected way. When he saw a woman with curly hair nervously talking to the maître, David knew it was her. Not by the description Helen had given, but by the way she held the torn bag with both hands, as if it might fall apart at any moment. There was something genuinely vulnerable in that gesture that made him instinctively rise. Sarah walked toward the table, mentally rehearsing an apology when her eyes met his. David was exactly how she imagined a successful businessman would be: elegant, serious, intimidating. But there was something in his eyes that surprised her. Genuine curiosity, not judgment. "Sarah," he stood up, extending his hand. I'm sorry for being late. You must be furious. I would understand if you wanted to leave." The words tumbled out, her voice betraying her nervousness. David studied her for a moment. The wrinkled dress, the stain on her shoulder, the strands of hair escaping from the undone bun, the faint scent of vanilla that emanated from her. Everything told a story of a rushed afternoon, of a life without luxuries, of a real woman. "Actually," he said, pulling out a chair for her to sit, "I was starting to think you were too smart to show up." Sarah sat down, confused. "What do you mean?" "Well, if I were a single mother working double shifts, that's what Helen told me about you, I would also be late for a date with a stranger." David sat across from her. "And I would probably be questioning what a businessman really wants on a Saturday night." The brutal honesty in his voice made Sarah relax slightly. "So you know who I am. I know you work hard, have an 8-year-old son, and that Helen insisted we meet for 3 months before I finally agreed." David smiled for the first time. "And you? What do you know about me?" Sarah hesitated. "That you're a businessman, punctual, and apparently very patient." "Two right, one wrong," David laughed. "I'm not patient at all. Ask any of my employees." "So why did you wait?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with unexpected intensity. David studied her, the way she kept her hands in, her lap to hide the torn bag, how she slightly bit her lower lip when nervous, how her dark eyes reflected a strength she didn't even know she possessed. "Because," he said slowly, "I have a feeling that tonight is going to be different from any other I've ever experienced." And for the first time in years, Sarah Johnson smiled without thinking about bills to pay, an uncertain future, or past disappointments. For a few seconds, she was just a woman sitting across from an interesting man on Christmas Eve. What neither of them knew was that this meeting would change not only their lives, but also the fate of 2 children who, on the other side of the city, were playing together without realizing that their parents were discovering something that would transform all of them forever. "You really smell like vanilla," David commented when the waiter walked away after taking their orders. His observation didn't sound like criticism, but rather a curious statement. Sarah felt her face heat up. "Sorry, I spent the afternoon baking. I tried to take a quick shower, but..." She gestured vaguely, as if she could explain her hectic afternoon with a wave of her hands. "Don't apologize. It's pleasant." David leaned slightly forward. "My house always smelled like cake when I was a child. The person who raised me made cornbread every Friday." There was something in his hesitation that Sarah noticed, but before she could ask, the waiter brought the wine that David had ordered, an Argentine Chardonnay that cost more than her weekly income, Sarah was sure. "Tell me about your son," David said, pouring wine for both of them. "Helen mentions that he is smart." Sarah's eyes lit up instantly. He is my whole life. He's 8. He is old, studies at Professor Antonio Carlos Public School, loves math and soccer. He dreams of being an engineer to build houses for everyone who doesn't have one." She laughed, a mix of pride and melancholy. "Sometimes he's more mature than I am." David paused with the glass halfway to his lips. "Professor Antonio Carlos, the school on Harmony Street." "You know it?" Sarah frowned, surprised. "My son goes there too. Ethan Anderson, 10th grade, but in extracurricular activities." David studied Sarah's expression, seeing the recognition grow in her eyes. "Ethan?" Sarah sighed. "Jake's best friend. That polite boy who Always shares his snack and... She stopped abruptly, processing the information. You're Ethan's father. And you're Jake's mother. David smiled, but there was tension in his shoulders. The boy, my son says, is the smartest in the whole school, and who teaches everyone how to do math in their heads. An awkward silence settled between them. Sarah nervously fiddled with the strap of her torn bag, while David drummed his fingers on the table. This is strange, Sarah finally murmured. Or fate, David replied, surprising himself with the word. Do you believe in fate? The question came out more intimate than Sarah intended. David watched her carefully. Sarah was not like the women he usually met in the social circles he frequented. There was an authenticity in her that disarmed him. The way she spoke about her son with genuine passion, how she didn't try to hide her financial condition, how her eyes filled with tears when she was emotional. I didn't used to believe, he said slowly, but Ethan talks about Jake every day. And today, for the first time, he asked me why I never invite his best friend's mother to dinner with us. What did you say? That maybe she wouldn't want to have dinner with me. Sarah let out a nervous laugh. Why wouldn't she? David studied her for a long moment. Because I'm the kind of man your friends should warn you to be careful of. Rich, older, with a history of relationships that don't work out. He paused. Because you probably think I just want to have fun with someone different before going back to my real world. His brutal honesty caught Sarah off guard. It was exactly what she thought, but hearing him say it out loud made her defenses crumble slightly. And is that what you want? She looked him directly in the eyes for the first time that night. I don't know what I want, David admitted. But I know that when Ethan started talking about the mother of Jake who works hard and is really nice, something in me became curious. And when Helen suggested this meeting, I accepted before even asking anything about you. The waiter brought the appetizers, bruschetta for David and a simple salad for Sarah, who had chosen the cheapest item on the menu. David noticed but didn't comment. Can I ask a personal question? Sarah asked after a few minutes of eating in silence. Of course. Why does your son go to a public school? I mean, you obviously can afford any private school in New York. David chewed slowly, as if deciding how much to reveal. Because I went to a public school, and because I want Ethan to understand that there are brilliant kids everywhere, not just in expensive colleges. He paused. And because the person who raised me always said that character can't be bought with money. The person who raised you, your parents, they died when I was 16. Car accident. David lowered his eyes. My housekeeper, Mrs. Smith, raised me from then on. She paid for my college. She taught me values. His voice faltered slightly. Sarah instinctively reached out, lightly touching his hand on the table. The gesture was so natural that neither of them immediately realized it. Is she still alive? She is. Lives in an apartment I bought for her in Queens. She'll be 70 next month. David looked at Sarah's hand over his. Ethan calls her Grandma Smith. Jake would love to meet a grandma, Sarah said softly. He doesn't have any living grandparents. And his father? The question hung in the air. Sarah withdrew her hand and went back to fiddling with the strap of her bag. Mark left me when he found out I was pregnant. He said he wasn't ready to be a father, that we had our whole lives ahead of us. Her voice turned bitter. 2 months later, I saw on social media that he was engaged to someone else. I'm sorry. Don't be. Jake is better off without him. Sarah straightened her shoulders. And so am I. David admired her strength. It wasn't self-pity or victimhood. It was pure determination. And you? Have you never gotten involved with anyone after? I dated a few men. It never lasted long. Sarah laughed humorlessly. It's hard to explain to someone that you can't go out on a Friday night because you don't have a babysitter, or that you can't travel on a weekend because your son has a soccer game. Most give up before even meeting Jake. But you kept trying? Jake deserves to have a complete family. I deserve to try to be happy. Sarah looked directly at him, but I started to give up on that idea. Started? Well, Helen insisted so much on this meeting that I eventually gave in. She said you were different and that I should give love a chance. Sarah made air quotes, mimicking her friend's dramatic voice. David laughed, a genuine laugh that completely transformed his face. Helen said the same thing. To me, that you were special and that I needed to open my heart. Our best friend is a romantic manipulator, apparently very effective. They laughed together, and the tension finally began to dissipate. David called the waiter to order the main course, noticing that Sarah had once again chosen the simplest option on the menu. Sarah, can I say something without sounding presumptuous? She nodded, chewing on a piece of lettuce. You don't have to choose the cheapest food on the menu to impress me. In fact, I'd be more impressed if you chose something you really wanted to eat. Sarah stopped chewing, her face turning red. I wasn't trying to... You were, and I understand. David leaned forward. But tonight, forget prices, forget differences, just be yourself. For a moment, Sarah considered getting up and leaving. The last thing she wanted was to seem like a charity case, but there was something in his voice, not condescension, but genuine understanding. All right, she finally said, but only because I love shrimp risotto and I've never eaten in a real restaurant. Shrimp risotto for the lady, David signaled to the waiter, and I'll have the same. As they waited for their food to arrive, David talked about his company, a holding that invested in technology and social projects. Sarah spoke about her homemade sweets and her dream of one day opening her own bakery. She mentioned the cleaning job she did, unashamedly, just as a fact. You're brave, David said suddenly. Brave. Raising a child alone, working 3 jobs, still dreaming about the future, still going on blind dates with strangers. He smiled. Still showing up 2 hours late and not running away. I almost ran away, Sarah admitted. I saw my reflection in the bathroom mirror and almost bolted. Good thing you didn't. Why? David looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a complicated puzzle. Because it's been years since I've had a real conversation with someone. Usually, people tell me what they think I want to hear. And what do you want to hear? The truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Sarah set her fork down, studying his face. Can I say an uncomfortable truth? Please. I'm afraid I'm starting to like you. The confession slipped out before she could censor herself. David froze, processing the words. Why does that scare you? Because men like you don't end up with women like me. Not for real. Sarah struggled to keep her voice steady. And because my son is starting to ask when he'll meet Gabriel's dad. And because for the first time in years I'm imagining what it would be like not to always be alone. David reached across the table, covering her hand with his. What if I told you that I'm also afraid I'm starting to like you? I'd say you're lying to be kind. Sarah, look at me. His voice became firm. I came here expecting polite conversation, a nice dinner, and a courteous goodbye. In 2 hours of conversation, you made me laugh more than I have in months. You talked about your son with a love that made me envious. You admitted your struggles without self-pity. You questioned my motivations without aggression. He paused. You're real in a way I haven't encountered in years. Sarah felt tears threaten her eyes. David, how about we make a deal? He intertwined his fingers with hers. How about we forget for a few weeks who we are on paper? You, the hard-working single mother, and me, the wealthy businessman, and discover who we really are. And the boys? The boys are already friends. Maybe it's time for the parents to become friends too. Sarah watched him carefully. There was sincerity in his eyes, but also a vulnerability she recognized, the fear of exposing oneself and being rejected. "A few weeks," she repeated slowly. "A few weeks," David confirmed. Neither of them knew that at that moment, on the other side of the city, Jake was telling Mrs. Thompson about his dream that his mom would meet someone cool like Ethan's dad, and that Ethan, in his room in West Side, was writing a school essay about how he wished his dad would meet someone who takes care of him like Jake's mom takes care of Jake. Fate sometimes begins with two children who see what adults take time to realize, that some people are meant to find each other, even when all signs indicate they are too incompatible to work out. "Mom, you're different today," Jake commented the next morning, watching Sarah hum as she prepared breakfast. It was Sunday, December 25th, and for the first time in years, she wasn't obsessively calculating the bills for the upcoming week. "Different how?" Sarah tried to sound casual, but a stubborn smile insisted on appearing at the corner of her lips. "I don't know. Happier." The boy tilted his head, studying his mother. "And you're singing that song that always plays on Mrs. Thompson's radio." Sarah stopped stirring the eggs in the pan. It was true. For the first time in months, she had woken up without the familiar weight of anxiety in her chest. The conversation with David had stretched until almost midnight, and when they finally said goodbye at the restaurant door, he had done something unexpected. He asked for her WhatsApp number, but didn't try to kiss her. "I respect your time," he had said, hands in his pockets, as if he were controlling himself not to touch her. "And I want you to know that this isn't just curiosity on my part." "Mom!" Jake poked her arm, bringing her back to the present. "Sorry, my love, I was thinking." Sarah flipped the eggs onto his plate, along with 2 slices of toasted bread. "How about we visit Mrs. Thompson today? She made French toast yesterday." "Can I call Ethan? He said his dad was going out yesterday too. Maybe they met." Sarah almost dropped the frying pan. "What?" "Ethan said his dad never goes out, but yesterday he went out for dinner. He said it was a social commitment." Jake made air quotes, mimicking what must have been his father's expression. "Do you think they met? New York isn't that big, right?" "New York has 12 million residents, Jake." Sarah laughed nervously. "It's quite large." "But it would be cool, right? Ethan always says his dad is kind of sad. And you get sad sometimes, too." The boy looked at her with that premature wisdom that always surprised her. It would be nice if you both weren't sad anymore. Before Sarah could respond, her phone vibrated. A message on WhatsApp from an unknown number. "Good morning, Sarah. I hope you slept well. Ethan woke up asking if he could invite Jake for lunch with us today. He said he needs to introduce his dad to his best friend. Obviously, the invitation extends to you as well. David." Sarah read the message 3 times before showing it to Jake, who practically jumped out of his chair. "I knew it! I knew you guys would meet," Jake shouted, making Sarah laugh. "Can I reply to him, Mom? Please?" "Calm down, sweetheart. We don't even know where they live, nor—" Another ping from WhatsApp. "I forgot to mention, I live on the West Side, but I thought we could have lunch somewhere neutral. A pizza place, maybe?" Ethan suggested. "Joe's Pizza at the mall. If you agree, I can pick you up." "David." Sarah looked at Jake, who was practically buzzing with excitement. "What do you think?" "I think Ethan has good taste in pizza," Jake said solemnly, "and I think you should wear that red dress Aunt Emily gave you." On the other side of the city, Ethan was having a similar conversation with his dad. "Dad, are you sure she's going to say yes?" The 10-year-old paced back and forth in the kitchen of their penthouse, nervous, because Jake said his mom is kinda shy around new people. David smiled, finishing up a shot of espresso on the Italian machine. We won't know until she responds, Ethan. But why is it so important to you? Ethan stopped pacing and looked seriously at his dad. Because Jake is my best friend, and I've never met his family, and because... He hesitated, as if about to reveal a big secret. Because you get sad when you think I don't notice. David almost dropped the cup. I'm not sad. You are. When you think I'm asleep, you sit on the balcony staring into space, and sometimes you sigh really loudly. Ethan moved closer to his dad. Grandma Smith said you need a real family. You and I are a real family. We are, but Jake said families can grow when people really like each other. Ethan tilted his head. Did you like Jake's mom? David looked at his son, his dark hair like his own, curious eyes, the emotional intelligence that always surprised him. I did. How much? Ethan, on a scale from 0 to 10? David laughed despite himself. 8. Only 8? Ethan frowned. What did she lack to be a 10? I need to get to know her better. That's why I invited her to lunch. Ethan smiled victoriously. That way you can go from 8 to 10, and then we can be a family of 4. David's phone vibrated. A response from Sarah. Jake is so excited that he's already picking out clothes. I accept the invitation, but we insist on splitting the bill. And you don't need to pick us up. We can meet you there. Sarah. David showed the message to Ethan, who made a face. She doesn't want you to pick them up. Why not? Because she's independent, son, and she wants to keep things simple. But you're going to insist on picking them up, right? Grandma Smith always says a true gentleman doesn't let a lady go alone. David quickly typed, I insist on picking you up. It would be a pleasure. And about splitting the bill, we can discuss that in person. I'll be there at noon. David. The response came within seconds. Okay, Maple Street, 847, Apt 34. Thank you, Sarah. Ethan read over his dad's shoulder and widened his eyes. Maple Street, is that far from here? A bit, David said carefully. Maple Street was in downtown New York, a very different area from the west side. Why do you ask? Because Jake always says it takes a long time to get to school. He takes 2 buses. Ethan paused. Dad, are they poor? The direct question from his son caught David off guard. Ethan, would you care if they were? The boy thought seriously for a moment. No, Jake is still my best friend, and he's smarter than everyone in my private school. But, he hesitated. But what? Sometimes he gets sad when the other boys talk about video games or trips he can't have. Ethan looked at his dad with concern. Can I share my things with him? David felt a tightness in his chest. You already share, son. I always see you giving him extra snacks. That's not enough. I want to give him bigger things, like, I don't know, a video game or new sneakers. Ethan shrugged. But Grandma Smith said that could hurt people's pride. Grandma Smith is wise. So how can I help without hurting? David knelt in front of his son, placing his hands on his shoulders. By being a good friend, by continuing to treat him exactly as you've always treated him, and by letting the adults handle adult matters. But you're going to take care of it, right? Jake's mom, I mean. Ethan, it's complicated. It's not. The boy interrupted with the absolute conviction of childhood. You like her, an 8, remember, she's Jake's mom. We have money. They need help. It's simple math. David laughed at his son's relentless logic. It's not math, Ethan. It's about feelings. And feelings are more complicated than numbers. Why do adults complicate everything? Ethan sighed dramatically. If it were me, it would be easy. You, like her, she likes you. You get together, and everyone is happy. What if she doesn't like me? Ethan looked at him as if he had said something absurd. "Of course she will like you, Dad. You're cool. You have money to take care of her and Jake and I are already friends. It's perfect." At exactly noon, David parked his black BMW in front of number 847 on Maple Street. The building was old, with peeling paint and a tiny lobby. Ethan looked out the window, curious, showing no judgment, just the natural curiosity of a child. Sarah appeared at the door of the building 5 minutes later, with Jake by her side. She wore a simple red dress and flat sandals, her hair framing her face. Jake wore a jersey from the New York Giants and sneakers that, although clean, showed signs of heavy use. "Dad, she's even more beautiful than I imagined," Ethan whispered. David had to agree. In the sunlight, Sarah was truly lovely. Not the artificial beauty of the women who attended the social events he used to go to, but a natural and captivating beauty. He got out of the car and went to meet them. "Sarah, you look beautiful," he said sincerely. "Thank you," she replied, blushing. "Jake, say hello to Mr. David." "Hi, Mr. David." Jake extended his hand with exaggerated formality. "Ethan talks a lot about you." "I hope it's all good things," David smiled, shaking the small hand. "And you can just call me David." Ethan jumped out of the car. "Jake, Dad, this is my best friend." The two boys greeted each other with that genuine joy of childhood, and within seconds they were already animatedly talking about the pizza they were going to eat. "They are really close," Sarah observed, smiling as she watched the boys. "Ethan talks about Jake every day. I would say Jake saved my son from loneliness." "And Ethan saved Jake from shyness," Sarah replied. "When they met, Jake was very withdrawn. Ethan included him in the group from day one." They got into the car, the boys in the back seat chatting about soccer and video games. David noticed in the rearview mirror that Jake was looking around with curiosity, but without envy. Just genuine fascination for his friend's world. "This car is like a spaceship," Jake commented, carefully touching the dashboard. Ethan wasn't exaggerating. "It's just a car, Jake," Ethan said naturally. "The important thing is that now our parents know each other." Sarah and David exchanged a glance in the rearview mirror, both thinking the same thing. The kids made everything simpler and at the same time more complicated. What none of the four knew was that this lunch would be just the first of many meetings, and that the complications to come would test not only the growing feelings between Sarah and David, but also the strength of the friendship between two children who had already decided that their parents belonged together. Tony's Pizzeria was packed that Christmas Sunday, with whole families celebrating the holiday among various pizzas and the lively buzz of overlapping conversations. David had managed to get a table in the corner, away from the main hustle, where they could talk with more privacy. "Mom, can I order soda?" Jake asked quietly to Sarah, clearly impressed with the menu that listed dozens of pizza flavors. "Of course, my love," Sarah replied, but David noticed her hesitation as she looked at the drink prices. "Ethan, how about we choose the pizzas together?" David suggested, giving Sarah a chance to relax without worrying about costs. The two boys leaned over the menu like strategists planning a battle, pointing out flavors and debating impossible combinations like chocolate with pepperoni and chicken with ice cream. "They are really best friends," Sarah observed, smiling as she saw Jake gesturing animatedly, something he rarely did with strangers. "Ethan has changed since he met Jake," David said, pouring her some water. "He used to be very quiet, almost shy. Now he brings friends home, talks about soccer. He even got into a fight once defending a smaller classmate." "He fought?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, concerned. "Nothing serious. He pushed a bigger kid who was humiliating another for wearing old sneakers." David paused significantly. "He told the bully that sneakers don't define anyone's character." Sarah felt her face heat up. It was a lesson she had taught Jake when he came home crying because some classmates had mocked his patched shoes. Did Jake tell him that? Probably. Ethan came home that day saying he had learned an important lesson from the smartest kid in school. David smiled. It seems our kids are educating each other. Dad, Ethan interjected in the conversation, can you tell Aunt Sarah about that school project? The garden one. David hesitated for a second. Ethan, what project? Sarah asked, curious. It's nothing much. David tried to downplay it, but Ethan was determined. Dad funded a garden at school and a new library, and the boy stopped when his father shot him a warning look. Sarah fell silent for a few moments, processing the information. You fund improvements at Jake's school? It's an investment in education, David replied uncomfortably. My company has a social program. How many schools? Sarah's question was direct. 5, David admitted. But this one isn't different from the others. It is, Ethan interrupted again. You go there every week. At the others, you just send money. Jake, who had been absorbed in the menu, looked up. Your dad goes to our school. I've never seen him there. You don't know because he dresses normally and talks to everyone, Ethan explained proudly. Once I went with him and saw him helping to paint the playground. Sarah felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, embarrassment, and a hint of irritation for not knowing she was being indirectly benefited by charity. Sarah, David began, noticing her change. Afterward we'll talk about it, she said softly, forcing a smile as the waiter approached to take their order. The boys chose 3 pizzas, margarita, chicken with cream cheese, and a mixed pizza. David ordered a beer, Sarah a fresh orange juice. For the next 15 minutes, the conversation flowed mainly among the kids who shared stories from school and made plans for their upcoming break. Jake, are you doing anything fun during the break? David asked, trying to include the boy in the conversation. We're visiting my aunt in New Jersey, Jake replied cheerfully. And my mom promised we would go to Central Park if she sells enough candy this week. David noticed Sarah shifting uncomfortably in her seat. What kind of candy do you make? He asked her. Cakes, chocolate truffles, little sweets. Simple things for kids' parties, Sarah replied, clearly preferring not to delve deeper into the topic. Jake's mom makes the best carrot cake in the world, Ethan declared. Jake always brings me a piece when there's leftovers. Ethan! Jake blushed. What? It's true. I once dreamed about that cake. Everyone laughed and the momentary tension dissipated. The pizzas arrived steaming and aromatic, and for a few minutes everyone focused on eating and discussing neutral topics, movies, music, soccer. It was when David was telling a funny story about Ethan trying to cook that his phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned. Excuse me, I need to take this. It's from the office. He stood up and stepped away from the table. Sarah seized the opportunity to have a serious conversation with Ethan. Ethan, can I ask you a question? Sure, Aunt Sarah. Does your dad always help people like this? Funding schools? Ethan nodded vigorously. He helps a lot of people. He built some apartments for people who didn't have homes, and he always gives jobs to people who were unemployed. The boy lowered his voice conspiratorially. But he doesn't like people to know. He says helping isn't for show. Jake looked at his mom curiously. Mom, why do you look strange? I don't look strange, Sarah lied. In fact, she was processing information that made her uncomfortable. David wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of person whose improvements in life she depended on indirectly. It was a power dynamic she didn't know how to navigate. David returned to the table with a worried expression. Is everything okay? Sarah asked. Problem at the office. Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow. He sat down but was visibly distracted. Dad, you look worried, Ethan observed. Just work, son. Jake, who was extremely observant for his age, noticed something. David, are you afraid of something?" The innocent question caught David off guard. He looked at the boy, his dark eyes filled with genuine concern, so much like his mother's. "Why do you ask that, Jake?" "Because when my mom worries about work, she makes the same face, like she's calculating really fast in her head." David smiled despite his worry. "You're very observant." "Jake notices everything," Ethan said proudly. "Once he guessed it was going to rain just by looking at the clouds." "It's not hard," Jake shrugged. "You just have to pay attention to the signs." Sarah studied David's face. Jake was right. There was something bothering him beyond a simple office problem. "David," she said gently, "if you need to go handle something, we understand." No, I'm here with you, and this is where I want to be." David forced a smile, but his eyes remained tense. His phone rang, again and again. On the third call, Ethan grew impatient. "Dad, answer already, it's bothering everyone." David sighed and answered, stepping just a few paces away from the table. Sarah and the boys could hear fragments of the conversation. "Can't wait until Monday? How much time do we have? Call an emergency meeting." When he returned, he looked visibly shaken. "David, what's happening?" Sarah asked, genuine concern in her voice. He looked at her, then at the boys, clearly torn between maintaining a facade of normalcy and the need to deal with the crisis. "It's complicated. A company we were about to acquire might have legal issues. If this is confirmed, it could affect several social projects I fund." "Including the school one?" Ethan asked, alarmed. "I don't know yet. We hope not." Sarah saw the worry settle on Ethan's face, and an unexpected maternal protectiveness surged within her. "And what does that mean exactly?" "It means I might have to re-evaluate some investments. Temporarily," David quickly added, seeing Ethan's expression. "But you're not going to stop helping people, right, Dad?" Ethan asked in a small voice. "Never, son. Just might need to reorganize things." Jake, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "My mom always says that when bad things happen, we find out who our true friends are." Everyone looked at him. Sarah felt proud of her son's premature wisdom, but also a pang of sadness that he had learned this lesson so early. "Jake is right," Sarah said, looking directly at David, "and true friends help each other, regardless of who has more money." David studied her for a long moment. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that if you're worried, we are worried too. Not because we depend on your help," she quickly added, "but because—" She hesitated, aware that she was about to admit something important. "Because we've started to care about you." Ethan beamed. "Does that mean you guys are dating now?" "Ethan!" David and Sarah said simultaneously, making the two boys laugh. But beneath the embarrassment, there was a truth neither was ready to admit. In just 24 hours, something had changed between them. It wasn't just attraction or curiosity, it was the beginning of something deeper and more frightening. What they didn't know was that the business crisis troubling David, it was just the first of many obstacles that would test not only their growing relationship, but also their ability to trust each other when the world around them began to crumble. And Jake's astute observation about discovering true friends in difficult times would prove to be more prophetic than either of them could imagine. The following Monday, Sarah arrived earlier than usual at Dr. Helen Carter's house in Upper East Side, where she cleaned every Monday and Wednesday. The 3-story house, with its well-kept garden and pool in the backyard, had always intimidated her a bit, not because of the wealth itself, but because of the impeccable perfection of every detail. "Sarah, it's so good to see you." Helen appeared in the kitchen, still in her robe, holding a cup of coffee. At 45, the dermatologist maintained an impeccable appearance, even just after waking up. "How was the date? You disappeared from WhatsApp after you confirmed." Sarah began organizing the cleaning supplies, avoiding her employer's anxious gaze. It was interesting. Interesting how? Interesting I never want to see him again. Or interesting I'm in love. Helen, Sarah sighed, finally turning around. Why didn't you tell me he is David Anderson? Helen almost dropped her cup. You know his last name. His son is Jake's best friend, Sarah explained, seeing the genuine surprise on the doctor's face. You really didn't know? Sarah, I swear to God I had no idea. I met David at a charity event 6 months ago. He seemed lonely. You were alone, I thought. Helen paused, processing. Ethan and Jake are friends. How did I not know this? Because you never asked where Jake goes to school, Sarah replied without accusation. And because Ethan studies there as an extracurricular activity. No one knows he is the son of the owner of Anderson Holdings. Helen sat on a stool at the kitchen island, still in shock. My God, Sarah, it's complicated, Sarah finished, going back to organizing the supplies. Very complicated. But did you hit it off? Did he seem to like you? Sarah stopped what she was doing, a vulnerable expression crossing her face. I think so. He was, different from what I expected. Kind, funny, real. She hesitated. Yesterday, we all had lunch together. Me, Jake, him and Ethan. And I found out he funds improvements at Jake's school. The new library, the garden, the renovated gym. All him. Helen was silent for a few moments. Are you upset about that? I'm confused, Sarah admitted. I don't know if he is genuinely interested in me or if I'm just another one of his social projects. Sarah Johnson, did you hear what you just said? Helen stood up, placing her hands on her hips. The richest man in New York spent 2 hours waiting for you, made a point to meet your son, and is worried about not coming off as condescending. If that isn't genuine interest, I give up on understanding men. Before Sarah could respond, the intercom buzzed. Helen frowned. It was only 8 in the morning, too early for visitors. Dr. Helen, it's David Anderson. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I need to speak with you urgently. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Helen looked at her with wide eyes, whispering, He's here. You can come up, David. Helen pressed the button, then turned to Sarah in a panic. What do I do? How do I explain that you work here? You don't need to explain anything, Sarah said, quickly taking off her apron and putting away the supplies. Just don't mention that I'm your cleaner, please. Sarah, there's nothing wrong with... Please, Sarah interrupted, her voice almost pleading. 3 minutes later, David appeared at the kitchen door, visibly agitated. He wore a dark grey suit and carried a leather briefcase, clearly coming straight from the office. Helen, I'm so sorry to intrude, but I need to... He stopped abruptly upon seeing Sarah. Sarah, what are you doing here? The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her face flush. Helen seemed to have swallowed her tongue, and David looked back and forth between them, trying to understand. David, Helen began nervously. Sarah and I are friends. Helen. Sarah gently interrupted, It's okay. She turned to David, lifting her chin with dignity. I work for Helen. I clean here on Mondays and Wednesdays. David stood still for several seconds, processing the information. You work here? I do, Sarah confirmed, bracing herself for the judgment or worse, the pity she knew would come. But David did something unexpected. He pulled out a chair and sat heavily, running his hands through his hair. My God, what a week, he murmured. David, Helen interjected cautiously, you said you needed to speak with me urgently. Yes. David looked at Sarah, hesitant. It's about work, but... I can leave, Sarah offered, starting to head for the door. No. David quickly stood up. I mean, if Helen doesn't mind, you can stay. In fact, I'd prefer you to stay." Helen and Sarah exchanged surprised glances. "All right," Helen said slowly. "What coffee would you like?" "Any kind, thank you." David rubbed his face with his hands. "Helen, you know I trust your discretion. And Sarah," he looked directly at her, "after yesterday, I feel I can trust you too." Sarah sat on another stool, curious despite the discomfort of the situation. "The company I mentioned yesterday, the one we were about to acquire, the problem is more serious than we thought." David accepted the cup of coffee that Helen offered him. "We found out they were laundering money. A lot of money." "Jesus," Helen whispered. "If I proceed with the acquisition, even unknowingly, I could be prosecuted as an accomplice. If I don't proceed, I lose 40 million that I've already invested, and more importantly—" He paused, looking at Sarah. "I will have to drastically cut social projects for the next 2 years to recover financially." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "Including the school project." "Including the school project," David confirmed miserably, "and 5 other projects that keep 400 families employed." Helen sat down at the table. David looked at Sarah. "Is there no other solution?" "There is one." David hesitated for a long time. "I can sell shares in other companies. I have proposals from international investors, but—" He paused again. "But," Sarah encouraged, "but these investors want total control, including veto power over where I invest my money. If I accept, I won't be able to fund social projects without their approval." "Would they approve?" Helen asked, although she already knew the answer. "International investors aren't interested in charity projects," David said bitterly. "To them, it would be a waste of potential profit." Sarah was quiet for a few minutes, watching David. There was something deeply compelling about seeing a powerful man facing a real moral dilemma, choosing between protecting his fortune and supporting projects that benefited others. "Can I ask you a question?" Sarah finally said. "Of course. Why do you fund these projects? What is your true motivation?" David studied her carefully. "Do you really want to know?" "I do. Because when I was 16, my family lost everything in an economic crisis. My parents died in an accident while driving to a meeting with lawyers trying to save what was left of the business." His voice lowered. "Our housekeeper, Mrs. Smith, used her own savings to keep me in school. She worked in 3 houses to pay for my college. When I graduated and started making money, I vowed to do the same for others." Sarah felt tears threaten her eyes. "Mrs. Smith, is she the grandmother Gabriel mentioned?" "Yes. She lives in an apartment I bought for her, receives a monthly pension, and Gabriel adores her." David smiled sadly. "She always says that money is only worth something if it's used to create dignity for others." "She's right," Sarah said softly. "She is. But now I don't know how to follow her advice without risking Gabriel's financial security." Helen, who had been quiet, suddenly slammed her hand on the table. "David, have you thought about looking for another type of investor? Someone who shares your values?" "Like who?" "How about partnering with other wealthy families who also do philanthropy, creating a social impact consortium?" David paused, considering. "It would be possible, but it would take time, and the current projects can't wait." Sarah, who had been thoughtful, suddenly stood up. "David, can I make a crazy proposal?" They both looked at her with curiosity. "What if you temporarily cut funding for structural improvements, but maintained basic support? Enough to keep the 400 families from being unemployed." "I don't know if that would be enough." "Let me finish," Sarah interrupted, gaining courage. "What if the benefiting communities participated more actively, organizing volunteer days, local fundraising campaigns, partnerships with small businesses in the area?" David looked at her intensely. "Go on." "The school Jake attends, for example, the parents could Organize to maintain the garden, run campaigns to buy books, get donations of paint to keep the playground. Sarah became animated as she spoke. You wouldn't cut support completely, just reduce it, and the community would compensate with work and creativity. That could work, David said slowly. It would reduce my costs by about 60%, without completely abandoning the projects. And it would create more of a sense of ownership in the communities, Helen added excitedly. They would feel like owners of the project, not passive beneficiaries. David was silent for several minutes, clearly processing the possibilities. Finally, he looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't decipher. Why did you make that suggestion? Why help someone who might have to cut the very benefits your community receives? Sarah met his gaze directly. Because I realized you're not just a wealthy businessman doing charity. You genuinely care about the people you help. She paused. And because Jake taught me that when someone we care about has problems, we don't just wait. We help find solutions. The expression on David's face softened completely. You said, someone we care about. Sarah blushed but didn't look away. I did. Helen, sensing the intimacy of the moment, discreetly began to leave the kitchen. I'll check if the garden needs watering. When they were alone, David stepped closer to Sarah. Sarah, I need to know one thing. What? When you found out I fund Jake's school, did you think I might be interested in you out of pity or condescension? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. I did think that. And now, after seeing me vulnerable, asking for help, facing the possibility of losing everything I've built? Sarah studied him, his hair tousled from running his hands through it, the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he awaited her response, as if it were the most important thing in the world. Now I think you're a good man, trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. She took a deep breath. And I think I'm starting to fall for you. David closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing her words. When he opened them, there was a determination in them that Sarah hadn't seen before. Sarah Johnson, he said solemnly, may I take you to dinner tonight? A simple place where we can talk leisurely about how to solve my business problems and find out if this between us is real. David Anderson, she replied with a smile that lit up her entire face. It would be an honor. What neither of them knew was that Helen was listening from the door, smiling like a satisfied Cupid, and that on the other side of the city, Gabriel was telling Jake that his dad had left the house happier than he had been in years, while Jake confided that his mum was humming while fixing her hair. Sometimes love begins with a crisis that forces two people to show themselves completely vulnerable to each other. And sometimes it is precisely in that vulnerability that they find the strength to build something real and lasting. The restaurant David chose for dinner was completely different from the Grand Hotel. The rustic table in the north side of New York served Southern cuisine in a relaxed and welcoming atmosphere. The rustic wooden tables, the walls decorated with elements of popular culture, and the aroma of olive oil and spices created an atmosphere that Sarah never imagined Jake would frequent. How do you know this place? Sarah asked, amazed as she watched Jake greet the waiter by name. Mrs. Smith brought me here when I was 17, Jake explained, pulling out a chair for her. She said I needed to experience the real America before graduating and becoming full of myself. He laughed at the memory. I've been coming here at least once a month for 20 years. Sarah smiled, relaxing for the first time since she saw him at Helen's house that morning. Mrs. Smith seems like a special person. She's the wisest person I know. Jake sat across from her, and she can't wait to meet you. What do you mean? Ethan told her about Jake, and consequently about you. She said that any woman who raises an honest and intelligent child on her own must have her heart in the right place. The waiter approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Jake, it's great to see you, and you brought someone special. John, this is Sarah. Sarah, this is John, who makes the best jambalaya in New York." "It's a pleasure, Miss Sarah." John extended his hand with genuine warmth. "What will you be having today? The usual for you, Mr. Jake?" "Actually, John, how about you choose for us something special, and for a special occasion?" As John walked away, Sarah looked at Jake with renewed curiosity. "You're very different from what I imagined when I found out who you were." "Different how?" "More human," Sarah said, searching for the right words. "In my mind, billionaires were people who lived in a bubble, always formal, always distant. But you know the waiter by name. You come to a popular restaurant. You let two boys choose the pizzas yesterday. And that surprises you?" Sarah shook her head. "Pleasantly. It surprises me in a good way." Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Sarah, can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" "Of course." "When I started making real money at 25, I began attending the appropriate social circles, charity galas, black-tie dinners, corporate events." He paused, swirling the glass of water between his hands. "And I realized it was extremely lonely to be surrounded by people who only cared about what I could do for them." Sarah listened intently, seeing a vulnerability in his eyes that touched her deeply. "That's when I decided to keep two worlds separate, the business world, where I wear a suit and talk about investments, and the real world, where I can just be Jake. Ethan only knows the real world. And me? Which world am I in?" Jake looked at her intensely. "You're in the only world that truly matters to me." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. She looked at the screen and frowned. "Sorry, it's from Jake's school. I need to take this." She moved slightly away from the table. "Hello?" Jake saw Sarah's expression change drastically during the conversation. Concern, then shock, then something close to panic. Yes, I'm coming to pick him up now. Thank you for calling." She hung up, her hands trembling slightly. "What happened?" Jake immediately stood up. "Jake got into a fight at school. He's in the office and I need to go get him now." Sarah frantically searched her bag for her keys. "I'm sorry, Jake, but I'm going with you." "You don't have to." "I'm going with you," Jake repeated firmly, already signaling to John. "My car is faster." The drive to the school was tense and silent. Sarah stared out the window, clearly worried, while Jake drove focused, occasionally glancing at her with concern. "Sarah," he finally said, "I'm sure. It's nothing serious. Jake is a sensible boy." "You don't understand," Sarah replied, her voice tense. "Jake never gets into trouble. Never. He's quiet, polite, avoids conflicts." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "If he got into a fight, it was for something very serious." They arrived at the school in 15 minutes. The gate was already closed, but the guard let them in after Sarah identified herself. They hurried through the hallways to the office, where they found a scene that made Sarah's heart stop. Jake was sitting in a chair, with a small cut on his lower lip, and his shirt torn at the shoulder. Next to him, equally hurt but trying to look brave, was Ethan. "Ethan?" Jake stepped forward, kneeling in front of his son. "What are you doing here? What time is it? You should be at home." "Dad," Ethan began, but was interrupted by the entrance of Principal Martin, a stern-looking woman in her 50s. "Parents, thank you for coming so quickly." She gestured for them to sit. "We have a delicate situation." "What exactly happened?" Sarah asked, sitting next to Jake and examining his injured face tenderly. "There was a confrontation in the schoolyard between your sons and 3 older boys." Principal Martin consulted her notes. "Apparently Jake was being teased because of his socio-economic status." Sarah felt her face heat with humiliation and anger. "What do you mean, teased?" Ethan, who had been quiet, suddenly exploded. "They were making fun of Jake because he wears old sneakers. They said he was poor and that he shouldn't be studying here because people like him lower the school standards." "Ethan," Jake gently warned. "No, Dad, they were being really cruel." Ethan turned to Jake. "Tell them what Bruno said." Jake looked at his mother, hesitant. "He said that a single mom who can't buy decent sneakers for her son should be ashamed to send him to a people's school." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Sarah felt tears of anger burning in her eyes while Jake clenched his fists. "And what happened next?" the principal asked. "Ethan got involved," Jake continued, looking at his friend in admiration. "He said they were talking nonsense and that I was the best kid. He's the smartest kid in the whole school. And then they started pushing Ethan," Ethan added. "They said he was a rich kid playing the victim." David closed his eyes, imagining how the situation had escalated. "Was that when you guys fought?" Sarah asked gently. "No," Jake said quietly. "The fight started when Bruno said—" He looked at Sarah, clearly reluctant to repeat it. "You can say it, my love. He said that you probably slept with the bosses to get a job, and that's why I had old sneakers, but you wore nice lipstick." The silence was deafening. Sarah went pale. David stood up abruptly, and Principal Martin sighed heavily. "That's when I hit him," Ethan said simply. "No one talks about Aunt Sarah like that." "And I hit the other two who tried to hold Ethan back," Jake added, "because he was defending me." David turned to Principal Martin. "And where are those 3 boys now?" "At home, suspended for 3 days. Bruno had to get 3 stitches in his nose." The principal paused. "Unfortunately, I also have to suspend Ethan and Jake for 2 days since they participated in the physical fight." "Principal Martin," David began, his voice controlled but clearly irritated. "My son and Jake were defending themselves from bullying and slander. The other boys initiated both the verbal provocation and the physical aggression. I understand, Mr. David, but our zero-tolerance policy for violence—" "Your zero-tolerance policy should apply to bullying as well," Sarah interrupted, finding her voice for the first time since the revelation of what had been said about her. "Those boys publicly humiliated my son, made offensive comments about our family, and when confronted resorted to physical violence." "Mrs. Johnson." "She's right," David said firmly, "and I want to know what measures will be taken to ensure this doesn't happen again." Principal Martin looked at them for a moment, then sighed. "I will reconsider the suspensions, but I need you to talk to your children about resolving conflicts non-violently." "Principal," Ethan said suddenly, "can I say something?" "Of course, Ethan. I don't regret defending Jake and Aunt Sarah, and if it happens again, I'll defend them again." He looked at his father. "Grandma Smith always said that a real man protects those he cares about." David felt a tightness in his chest from pride and concern at the same time. "And I don't regret helping Ethan," Jake added, looking at his mother. "You've always taught me that real friends stick together in our tough times." Half an hour later, they left the school together. The boys walked ahead, talking quietly and occasionally laughing despite their injuries, while Sarah and David followed behind in silence. "Sarah," David finally said, "I'm sorry for what happened. It wasn't your fault. Partly it was. Ethan is here because of me. If he weren't here, Jake would have faced those boys alone," Sarah finished. "At least this way he had someone by his side." They reached the car, and David opened the back door for the boys. As Sarah was about to head to the passenger side, David gently held her arm. "Sarah, those boys were completely wrong about you." "Were they?" Sarah looked at him, a deep pain in her eyes. "David, I clean houses. I depend on the charity of people like you for my son to have a decent education. Maybe they're not so wrong." "Stop," David said firmly. "Don't let the cruel words of ignorant teenagers make you question your worth." "My worth?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "David, you saw where I live. You know what I do for a living. In what world do we really have anything in common?" David looked at the two boys in the back seat. Ethan was sharing a candy with Jake, and both were laughing at something on Ethan's phone, completely oblivious to the adults' conversation. In a world where two kids from completely different backgrounds became brothers at heart, David said softly, in a world where a brave woman makes me laugh for the first time in years, in a world where I finally found someone who sees me as a person, not as a bank account. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, tears in her eyes. "David, I know we're from different worlds. I know there are real obstacles we will need to face." David took her hands in his. "But I also know that when you look at me, I don't see calculation or interest. I see something real, and it's been a long time since I felt something real." "And what if it doesn't work out? What if the differences are too great?" David looked again at the boys, who were now humming a song together. "Then at least our kids will have the most beautiful friendship I've ever seen in my life," he replied. "But Sarah, I really want to try to see if it can work." Sarah followed his gaze to Jake and Ethan. Her son was smiling in a way she hadn't seen in months, relaxed, happy, protected. Ethan treated Jake with a brotherly affection that made her heart tighten with emotion. "Okay," she finally said, "let's try to figure it out." What neither of them knew was that this fight at school would be just the first of many tests their relationship would face, and that the cruel words of teenagers would echo in future moments of crisis, when the differences between their worlds would seem insurmountable. But for now, in that moment in the school parking lot, with two kids who had become brothers singing in the back seat, everything seemed possible. 3 weeks after the school incident, Sarah and David had established a delicate but comforting routine. He would pick her up after work twice a week, and on Sundays they would do simple outings with the boys. Parks, movies, diners. Ethan had practically moved into Sarah's house on weekends, sleeping on the floor of Jake's room as if they were real brothers. It was a rainy Thursday. It was February when Sarah's world crumbled. She was in Dr. Helen Carter's kitchen, preparing a carrot cake to take home, a recipe that Helen had specifically requested, claiming she needed to learn how to make homemade desserts, when her cell phone rang. The unknown number made her hesitate before answering. "Hello? Sarah? Sarah Johnson?" The polite female voice on the other end had an edge that made Sarah alert. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Patricia Neves. I'm a journalist for People and Power magazine. I would like to ask you some questions about your relationship with businessman David Anderson." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "How did you get my number?" "That's not important right now. What matters is that I have some interesting photos of you two together, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to comment before we publish the article." "What kind of article?" Sarah asked, though she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "The billionaire's new passion. Elite businessman involved with housekeeper." "It's an interesting story, don't you think? The business mogul and the maid. Quite romantic, very pretty woman." Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, feeling nauseous. "I have nothing to declare." "Are you sure?" "Because I have information that you met through her employer, that he frequents the house where you work, that he finances your son's school." The journalist's voice was becoming sharper. "Some people might interpret this as opportunism." "Opportunism," Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "Well, a single mother, without resources, who manages to attract the attention of one of the richest men in New York. You understand how that might look, right?" Sarah hung up the phone with trembling hands. She immediately called David, but it went to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. Helen entered the kitchen at that moment, returning from her office. "Sarah, you look pale. What happened?" With a shaky voice, Sarah recounted the journalist's call. Helen's expression grew increasingly serious as she listened. "Sarah, you need to tell David immediately. I tried calling, he's not answering." "Then let's go to his office." "Helen, I can't just show up at his office. What if someone sees me?" "Sarah Johnson, stop underestimating yourself," Helen exploded. "You are not a gold digger, you are not an opportunist, and you are not inferior to anyone. David has the right to know what's happening." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang again. This time it was David. "Sarah, I'm sorry I missed your call. I was in an important meeting. How are you?" "David," her voice trembled. "We need to talk. Urgent. What happened? Are you okay? Is it Jake?" "It's not Jake. It's about us." Sarah took a deep breath. "A journalist called me. She's going to publish an article about our relationship." The silence on the other end lasted too long. "David." "I'm here. What kind of article?" Sarah repeated word for word what the journalist had said. With each sentence, David's silence grew heavier. "David, you need to say something." "Sarah, where are you?" "At Helen's house. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't talk to anyone else about this, okay?" When David arrived, he looked visibly tense. He was wearing a dark suit, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it multiple times. Helen left them alone in the living room. "Sarah, I'm so sorry this is happening." "David, tell me something honestly." Sarah looked him directly in the eye. "Have you been through this before?" He hesitated for a second too long. "Yes." "With how many women?" "Sarah, how many, David?" "3, maybe 4, depending on what you consider a serious relationship." Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach, and it always ended because of media exposure. "Not exactly, but the pressure from the media was a contributing factor." "A contributing factor," Sarah repeated slowly. "David, what are you not telling me?" David stood up and began pacing the room, clearly agitated. "Sarah, you need to understand how it works. When you have my level of public exposure, any relationship becomes news, especially if the woman is socially inappropriate." "I didn't say that, but that's what you meant." Sarah stood up too, her voice gaining strength. "David, answer me one very simple question. Did you know this would happen?" "I suspected it could happen." "And yet you continued seeing me. You kept bringing Ethan to my house, integrating our kids." Sarah felt tears of anger burning her eyes. "Did you use me as a social experiment?" "Sarah, that's not it. You know that's not it." "Do I? Do I really?" Sarah grabbed her bag. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the billionaire had a little fun with the housekeeper, until the novelty wore off." "Stop, Sarah, you're being unfair." "Unfair?" Sarah laughed humorlessly. "Unfair is letting a woman fall in love without warning her that she would be publicly exposed as the sexual curiosity of the richest man in New York." "Did you fall in love with me?" The question came out quietly, vulnerably. Sarah paused at the door, tears now flowing freely. "Completely. And that's the most pathetic part of this whole story." Before David could respond, she stormed out, slamming the door. The next morning, Sarah woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 messages on WhatsApp. Most were from unknown numbers, journalists wanting interviews, curious onlookers, and some cruel comments from people who had already read the article online. Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring his cereal when she appeared. "Mom, Ethan tried to call me 5 times, but I didn't know if I should answer." "You did well, my love." Sarah sat down next to him, noticing he was quieter than usual. "Jake, some things are going to change in the next few days, okay?" "Because of Ethan's dad?" Sarah looked surprised at her son. "How do you know?" "Mrs. Thompson showed something on her phone. There's a photo of you and Ethan's dad. Sarah was online. Jake looked at her with that premature maturity that always surprised her. Are people saying bad things about you? Sarah felt her heart break. Some people, yes. But they don't really know you. They don't. Jake thought for a moment, stirring his cereal in the milk. Mum, do you really like Ethan's dad? I do, Sarah answered honestly. And does he like you? I thought he did. Then why are people being mean? Sarah pulled Jake into a hug. How to explain to an 8-year-old that the adult world was cruel to those who dared to cross invisible social lines? Sometimes, my love, people get uncomfortable when they see things that are different from what they're used to. That's just stupid. Yes, it is stupid. They were interrupted by the doorbell. Sarah looked through the peephole and saw David at the door with an exhausted expression. He was carrying several newspapers under his arm. She opened the door but didn't invite him in. Sarah, we need to talk. We talked yesterday. No, we didn't talk. You accused me and left. I need to explain some things. Jake appeared behind his mother. Hi, Mr. Anderson. Is Ethan okay? David knelt in front of the boy. He is, Jake. He's worried about you and your mum, but he's fine. Can he come over today? David looked at Sarah. That depends on your mom. Sarah sighed. As hurt as she was by David, she couldn't punish the kids. Of course he can. But maybe it's better if you stay inside today. Because of the journalists? Jake asked naturally. David looked surprised at the boy, then at Sarah. He knows. Jake is smart, and we live in the same real world where things have consequences. David stood up. Sarah, please. 5 minutes. She hesitated, then turned to Jake. My love, go brush your teeth. I'll talk to Mr. Anderson quickly. When they were alone in the hallway, David extended the newspapers to her. Did you see? Sarah took the first newspaper and felt her stomach churn. The headline read, The Tycoon and the Maid, Romance or Opportunism. The photo was of her and David leaving the southern restaurant, him holding her hand, both smiling. On its own, it was a beautiful photo, but the context made it sordid. Sarah, I spent the whole night with my public relations team trying to control the damage. Control the damage? Sarah stared at him. David, listen to what you're saying. Am I the damage that needs to be controlled? No. You don't understand. The damage is the malicious speculation, the distorted interpretations. And what's the correct interpretation, David? Explain to me how the media should portray our relationship. David was silent for a few seconds, and that was enough for Sarah to have her answer. You don't know, she said softly. You really don't know how to present this because deep down you also think it's strange. Sarah, that's not true. Then answer me a very simple question. If I were a lawyer or a doctor or a businesswoman, would you be worried about damage control? David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Your hesitation already gave me the answer. Sarah handed the newspapers back to him. David, you're a good man, and I know you didn't mean to hurt me. But this has shown us something important. We really are from different worlds to make this work. Sarah, it's not that simple. It is, David. It's exactly that simple. Sarah took a deep breath. I fell in love with you, completely, but I can't date someone who feels embarrassed when our relationship goes public. I'm not embarrassed by you. You are. Maybe not consciously, but you are. And that's okay, David. I understand. Sarah smiled sadly. But I can't expose my son to this. I can't teach Jake that love is about hiding who you really are. David stood still in the hallway for a long moment after Sarah closed the door. On the other side, he could hear Jake asking if Ethan could still come to visit him, and Sarah's gentle voice explaining that it might be better to wait a few days. When he finally went down the stairs, David realized he had lost not only the woman he had fallen in love with, but also the chance to give his son the loving family that Ethan so desired. and that perhaps for the first time in his life, money and power were not enough to solve a problem he had created himself. 2 weeks passed in absolute silence. Sarah had disconnected the landline and blocked all unknown numbers after journalists started calling directly for Jake, trying to get statements from an 8-year-old. The situation had turned into a media circus that she never imagined possible. "Mom, why can't I go to school anymore?" Jake asked for the 10th time that morning, watching Sarah make homemade bread with more vigor than necessary. "I've explained, my love. There are strange people trying to take photos and ask questions. It's just until things calm down." "But what about Ethan? Can't he go to school either?" Sarah stopped kneading the dough. It was the hardest question to answer. "Ethan is fine, Jake. His dad can protect him better." "He has security?" "He does." Jake was thoughtful for a moment. "Mom, are we too poor for Ethan to be my friend?" The question hit Sarah like a bullet. She turned to her son, her hands still covered in flour. "Jake Johnson, listen carefully to what I'm going to say." Her voice was firm, but her eyes shone with contained tears. "True friendship has no price. You and Ethan are brothers at heart, regardless of how much money your families have." "Then why can't he come here? Why can't I talk to him?" Sarah knelt in front of her son, holding his small hands. "Because sometimes adults complicate simple things, and sometimes to protect people that we love, we need to step away for a while. Are you protecting Ethan from us?" The question was so innocent and yet so insightful that Sarah felt her heart tighten. "I'm protecting you, my love, and maybe Ethan too." On the other side of the city, Ethan was having a similar conversation with his father, but with much less patience. "Dad, it's been 2 weeks since I last saw Jake. 2 weeks." The 10-year-old paced anxiously around the living room of their penthouse. "You said we would sort this out." David was sitting on the sofa, surrounded by newspapers and magazines, all with variations of the same story about his scandalous romance. There were deep, dark circles under his eyes, and he hadn't shaved in 3 days. "Ethan, it's complicated." "It's not," Ethan shouted, losing his composure. "You like Aunt Sarah, she likes you, and Jake and I are best friends. Why is everyone complicating this?" "Because the real world is complicated. The real world is stupid." Ethan threw himself onto the armchair, crossing his arms. "Grandma Smith said you're being a coward." David looked up, surprised. "Grandma Smith said what? That you're letting what other people think be more important than what you feel?" Ethan stared at him with the brutal honesty of childhood. "She said that's not what she taught you." David rubbed his face with his hands. Mrs. Smith had indeed given him a historic lecture 3 days earlier when he tried to explain why it was better for everyone if he distanced himself from Sarah temporarily. "Ethan, you don't understand the consequences." "What consequences?" "Aunt Sarah will be sad, you will be sad, I will be sad, and Jake will be sad. Those consequences?" David fell silent. In the past 15 days, he had received calls from worried investors about his public image, snide comments at corporate events, and even a subtle suggestion from a board of directors to handle the situation discreetly, but nothing hurt as much as the look of disappointment on Ethan's face. "Dad," Ethan continued, his voice lowering, "you always taught me that a real man protects those he loves. Why aren't you protecting Aunt Sarah?" "I am protecting her. By stepping away from her, You're abandoning her when she needs you the most," Ethan interrupted, "just like Jake's dad did." The comparison hit like a bucket of cold water. David looked at his son, seeing not just disappointment but real pain in his eyes. "Ethan, it's not the same." "It is. You're leaving her alone when things got tough." Ethan stood up, tears finally starting to fall. "I was proud of you, Dad. Now I'm ashamed." The boy ran to his room, leaving David alone with the weight of his own choices. That afternoon, Sarah was hanging laundry in the small backyard of the building when Mrs. Thompson approached with a worried expression. "Sarah, dear, there's an elegant lady at the front desk asking for you." "A journalist? Doesn't seem like it. She said her name is Smith and that she knows your friend." Sarah felt her heart race. Mrs. Smith, the woman who had raised David, whom Ethan called Grandma. Is she alone? Alone. Very elegant but simple. She seems like a nice person. Sarah hesitated. Talking to anyone connected to David could reignite media attention. But curiosity and something deeper led her to agree. "You can ask her to come up." 5 minutes later, Sarah opened the door to a nearly 70-year-old black woman, her grey hair neatly styled in an elegant bun, wearing a simple but well-tailored navy blue dress. There was dignity in every movement of hers, and her dark eyes radiated a wisdom that came from decades of a life fully lived. "Sarah Johnson?" The voice was soft yet firm. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Louisa Smith. I believe David mentioned my name." Sarah invited her in, offering coffee, which Mrs. Smith accepted politely. They sat at the small kitchen table, where Jake was doing homework. "Jake," Sarah called her son, "this is Mrs. Smith, Ethan's grandmother." Jake immediately looked up, his eyes shining. "Grandma Smith, Ethan talks a lot about you. He said you make the best cornbread in the world." Mrs. Smith smiled, and her whole face lit up. "And you must be the famous Jake who won my grandson's heart. Ethan talks about you every day. How is he? I haven't seen him in 2 weeks." Jake's voice turned melancholic. "He's sad, dear. Very sad. Just like his father." Sarah served the coffee, trying to keep her hands steady. "Mrs. Smith, I can imagine why you came here. I came because I'm an old busybody who can't stand to see the children I raised making mistakes." Mrs. Smith looked directly at her. "And I came because I wanted to meet the woman who managed to break down the walls David built around his heart." "Mrs. Smith, let me finish, my dear." The older woman's voice was gentle but determined. "I raised that boy since he was 16. I saw him become a successful man, but I also saw him drift further away from people, afraid of being used, manipulated, disappointed." Jake listened attentively, occasionally glancing at his mother. "When Ethan started talking about Jake, it was the first time I saw David really interested in his son's social life. And when he began to mention Jake's mom, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years." "And what was it?" Sarah asked softly. "Hope," Mrs. Smith simply replied. "Hope that there was someone in the world who could like him for who he really is, not for what he has." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill. "Mrs. Smith, I really liked him, I do, but he acted like a coward when things got tough." The older woman's frankness, Marina, was surprised. "Do you think he was cowardly?" "I think my boy spent so much time being a businessman that he forgot how to be a man." Mrs. Thompson sipped her coffee slowly. "He forgot that those who love protect. They don't abandon." Jake interjected in the conversation. "Grandma Thompson, my mom didn't want to abandon your son. She was protecting everyone." Mrs. Thompson looked at the boy with admiration. "You are indeed smart, just like Ethan always says. And you're right. Your mother is trying to protect you all, but do you know what, Jake?" "What?" "Sometimes, when we step back to protect someone, we end up hurting more than helping." Marina looked at Mrs. Thompson, understanding that the conversation had taken a deeper turn. "Mrs. Thompson, what are you trying to tell me?" "I'm saying that maybe you both are right and wrong at the same time." Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. "David was wrong to care more about what others think than about his feelings. You are right not to accept being treated as a secret or a shame. But maybe there's a third option that neither of you considered. What? Mrs. Thompson smiled, and Marina saw where Ethan had inherited that mischievous sparkle in his eyes. Face the world together, with your heads held high, showing everyone that true love is not ashamed of itself. Jake clapped his hands. Yes, just like in the movies. Marina laughed despite the pain in her chest. Mrs. Thompson, it's more complicated than that. Is it? The older woman asked. Marina, can I ask you something very direct? Of course. Do you still love my son? Marina looked at Jake, who was watching her expectantly, then back at Mrs. Thompson. I do, she admitted softly. Very much. And he loves you too. I can guarantee that. Mrs. Thompson stood up. Then maybe it's time for both of you to stop running from each other and start fighting for what you feel. After Mrs. Thompson left, Marina stayed in the kitchen for a long time, absently stirring the cold coffee, while Jake returned to his homework in silence. Mom, he finally said. Yes, my love. Grandma Thompson is right. Sometimes running away hurts more than facing it. Marina looked at her son, his 8 years of age but decades of wisdom in his dark eyes. What do you think I should do? I think you should call Gabriel's dad and tell him that you miss him too. And what if he doesn't want to talk to me anymore? Jake shrugged. At least you'll know you tried. That night, after putting Jake to bed, Marina stood in front of the phone for a whole hour. 3 times she picked up the receiver, 3 times she gave up, but at 11 o'clock she finally dialed the number she knew by heart. David answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting. Marina. Hi, she said simply. How are you? Terrible. And you? Terrible too. They fell silent for a few seconds, just listening to each other's breathing. David, Marina finally said, we need to talk. For real this time. Where? I don't know. Somewhere we can be honest with each other without worrying about who's watching. David thought for a moment. I know a place. Where? Grandma Thompson's house. She said you two met today. Marina smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. Your grandma is a very wise woman. She is. And I think she's right about one thing. What? That maybe it's time for us to stop running from each other and start fighting for what we feel. On the other end of the line, Marina closed her eyes, feeling hope rekindle in her chest. Tomorrow. What neither of them knew was that their children had found a way to communicate through Gabriel calling Mrs. Thompson, and they were already planning an operation to reunite the parents in case the adults couldn't resolve things on their own. After all, as Gabriel had told Jake during one of those secret calls, if the adults don't know how to be happy on their own, the kids have to help. Mrs. Thompson's house in Queens was exactly as Marina had imagined. Cozy, filled with plants and with the permanent aroma of cake baking in the oven. Located on a quiet street, away from the media spotlight, it seemed like the perfect place for conversations that needed to happen without external interference. You both arrived at the same time, Mrs. Thompson observed with satisfaction as she opened the door for Marina and David at 3 in the afternoon on Sunday. That's a good sign. Marina and David greeted each other awkwardly, like two strangers who had once been close. She wore a simple dress and had her hair tied up. He was without a suit for the first time in weeks, wearing a blue polo shirt and jeans. Where are the kids? Marina asked, noticing the absence of Gabriel and Jake. Gabriel took Jake to see the park nearby, Mrs. Thompson explained with a mischievous smile. He said you needed privacy to sort out the mess you made. David couldn't help but smile. When did Gabriel call Jake without me knowing? Smart boy. He found Mrs. Thompson's number and has been calling every day. Mrs. Thompson led them to the living room, decorated. with well-preserved antique furniture. Now sit here and talk like adults. I'll make some coffee." Once they were alone, the initial silence was almost oppressive. Marina looked at a picture frame on the coffee table. Teenage David hugging Mrs. Thompson, both genuinely smiling. "You were very skinny," she finally commented. "I was. Mrs. Thompson used to say I looked like a chicken skewer." David relaxed slightly. "Marina, David, before you speak, I need to say a few things." Marina turned to face him completely. "These 2 weeks made me understand things about myself that I didn't want to admit." "Like what?" "Like the fact that I was ready to give up on you at the first difficulty." Marina lowered her eyes. "When that journalist called, my first reaction was to assume the worst about you. I didn't even give you a chance to explain before deciding that you were using me." David watched her closely. "But you had reasons to be suspicious. I reacted poorly. You reacted out of fear, and I reacted with insecurity." Sarah sighed. "The truth is, when I saw our picture in those tabloids, a part of me felt ashamed. Ashamed of what? Ashamed of dating. Someone so out of my league. Ashamed of people thinking I was taking advantage of you. Ashamed of—" She paused, struggling with her words. "Ashamed of being in love with someone I thought would eventually leave me anyway." David leaned forward. "Sarah, no. Let me finish." She took a deep breath. "Because I realized I was sabotaging our relationship before you could hurt me. I was looking for excuses to end things before you naturally grew tired of me. That wasn't going to happen. I didn't know that, and you didn't give me any assurance." Sarah finally looked him in the eye. "David, when you started worrying about damage control, you confirmed all my fears of not being enough for you." David was silent for a few moments, processing. "You're right. Completely. I was more concerned with managing the situation than protecting you." "Why?" "Because," David hesitated, "because I was scared too." "Of what?" "That maybe people were right. Maybe I really was just a bored rich guy having fun with an interesting woman before going back to my real world." Sarah felt like she had been slapped. "David! I know it sounds terrible, but Sarah, you need to understand. I spent years being pursued by women who wanted my money, my status, my influence. When I met you, it was like finding clean water in the desert." He stood up, starting to pace the room. "But when the media started speculating, a part of me got paranoid. What if you really were different? What if I was just a financial dream for you?" "And you believed that?" "For a few days, yes. I hate to admit it, but I did." David stopped in front of her. "Until Ethan gave me a talking to that made me realize I was destroying the best thing that had happened in my life because of irrational fears." Sarah was quiet for a while, absorbing his brutal honesty. "David, can I ask you something? Anything. If I were a lawyer or a doctor, would you have had those fears?" David opened his mouth to respond quickly, then paused. The hesitation was his answer. "Probably not," he admitted quietly. "So the problem isn't that I could be interested in your money. The problem is that you think someone from my social class could only be interested in your money." The observation hit David like a lightning bolt. "I never thought of it that way." "David, you've known me for 2 months. You saw me work 3 jobs to support my son. You saw me refuse your offers of help several times. You saw me get embarrassed when you paid for expensive dinners." Sarah stood up as well. "At what point did I show any interest in your money besides feeling uncomfortable with it?" David sat heavily on the couch, running his hands through his hair. "Never. At no point." "So why was it so easy for you to believe that I could be taking advantage?" "Because," David struggled with the answer, "because it's easier to believe that someone wants you for what you have than for who you are. The vulnerability in his voice made Sarah's heart ache. She sat beside him, keeping a small but respectful distance. "David, have you ever thought that maybe you use your money as a wall? That it's easier to assume people are selfish than to risk opening up for real?" "What do you mean?" "If all women only want your money, you never have to risk getting emotionally involved for real. There's always an excuse not to fully commit." Sarah studied him. "It's a very effective protection." David was silent for several minutes, clearly processing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "You might be right. Maybe I've used that as an excuse not to fall in love for years. And now? Are you really in love now?" David looked directly at her. "Completely, desperately, to the point where I spent 2 miserable weeks without you and realized I'd rather face any public scandal than be away from you." Sarah felt tears threatening. "David." "Sarah, can I ask you a question now?" "Of course." "Could you date someone knowing that from time to time our relationship would be exposed publicly, that there would be nasty comments, speculation, invasion of privacy?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "It depends." "On what?" "On how you would react to it. If you got embarrassed, defensive, worried about your reputation, no, I couldn't do it." She paused. "But if you faced it with me, if you protected me from the cruelest parts without hiding it like it was a secret, yes, I could." "And Jake, could you expose your son to that?" "Jake is stronger than I imagined, and he loves you." "David, he loves you and Ethan." Sarah smiled sadly. In those 2 weeks, the question he asked the most wasn't about the tabloids or photographers. It was when he could see Ethan again. At that moment, they heard excited voices in the garden. Through the window, they could see Jake and Ethan running toward the house, Ethan carrying a colorful kite and Jake holding the spool. "Looks like someone had fun," David observed. "David," Sarah said quickly before the kids came in, "if we're going to try again, it has to be different." "How?" "No secrets, no shame, and if the media shows up again, we face it together." Sarah looked at him seriously. "I'm too proud to be hidden, and you're too important to me for me to give up at the first difficulty." David smiled, the first genuine smile in weeks. "It's a deal. It's a deal." The door creaked open as Ethan and Jake rushed in, abruptly stopping upon seeing their parents sitting close together on the couch. "Did you two make up?" Ethan asked directly, without beating around the bush. "We're working on it," David replied. "Working takes a long time," Jake observed seriously. "We've already decided that you have to stay together because we are a family now." Sarah and David exchanged an amused glance. "Family?" Sarah repeated. "Of course." Ethan stepped closer, placing one hand on his father's shoulder and the other on Sarah's. "Jake is my brother. You're kind of my mom too. Dad is kind of Jake's dad, and Grandma Smith is everyone's grandma." "It's simple math," Jake added, making David laugh. Mrs. Smith appeared at the door with a tray of coffee and cake, watching the scene with satisfaction. "Kids solve everything faster than adults," she commented, serving the coffee. "Maybe because they see with their hearts, not with fear." David looked around the room, Sarah smiling as Ethan showed her drawings he had made for her, Jake explaining his science project to Mrs. Smith, the golden afternoon light streaming through the lace curtains. For the first time in years, David Anderson felt at home, not in a house he had bought, but in a family he had chosen, and that had chosen him back. "Sarah," he said softly while the kids were distracted. "Yes? Do you want to have dinner with me tomorrow, in public, without hiding, without worrying about who will see?" Sarah smiled, and David was sure he had never seen anything more beautiful. "I do. But this time I choose the restaurant." "Where?" "At the Brooklyn Farmers Market. Empanadas and sugarcane juice like normal people. David laughed loudly, causing the kids to stop and look. It's a deal, and then we'll take the boys to the movies. All together? All together. Ethan and Jake exchanged glances and smiled conspiratorially. The operation to reunite the parents had been a complete success. What they didn't know was that afternoon at Mrs. Smith's house would mark the beginning not only of a renewed relationship, but of a united family that would face all the storms yet to come together, some of which would be more challenging than any of them could imagine. The August morning was exceptionally clear when Sarah woke up in the new apartment in Brooklyn, a 3-bedroom space that David had insisted on helping to finance, but which she insisted on paying half of, even though her installments were symbolic compared to his. It was her first home, and every corner reflected her personality, plants everywhere, a spacious kitchen where she could expand her baking business, and a balcony where Jake and Ethan spent hours playing video games or just chatting. "Mom, Ethan is already here," Jake shouted from his room, where he was getting ready for another day at the new school. After the media scandal, David had suggested moving both boys to a private school, but Sarah and the kids preferred to stay in the public school. Now, with a much better structure, thanks to the reforms the community had managed to implement, with David's reduced but constant support. "I'm coming," Sarah replied, quickly applying lipstick. Today was a special day, the official opening of the Brooklyn Community Center, a project that had emerged from David's financial crisis and transformed into a social revolution in the area. David entered the kitchen, already dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, his official uniform for community events, very different from the Italian suits he wore in the corporate world. In recent months, he had learned to navigate between these two worlds without embarrassment, and Sarah had learned to feel comfortable in both. "Good morning, love," he said, kissing her softly before greeting Jake and Ethan, who rushed into the kitchen. "Dad, is the surprise ready?" Ethan asked, barely able to contain his excitement. "What surprise?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, suspicious. "You'll find out at the opening," David said mysteriously, pouring coffee for everyone. The last 6 months had been a roller coaster of emotions and growth. After the reunion at Mrs. Smith's house, Sarah and David decided to face everything that came their way together. The strategy worked better than they had hoped. When they appeared publicly at the farmers' market hand in hand, eating empanadas and chatting naturally with vendors and customers, the media narrative began to change. Instead of the billionaire and the maid, they started being portrayed as the businessman who found true love. The authenticity of their relationship, combined with the genuine social work they did together, even won over the most cynical critics. "Sarah, are you nervous?" Mrs. Smith asked when they arrived at the site where the opening would take place. The family matriarch had officially become Jake's grandmother too, and her presence brought emotional stability to everyone. "A little," Sarah admitted, watching the crowd gather. There were community residents, representatives from other NGOs, some journalists, and even members of the boards of directors of David's companies, an unlikely mix that had become natural over the months. The community center was truly impressive. What had started as an emergency solution to budget cuts had transformed into a model for community development. There were rooms for vocational courses, an industrial kitchen where Sarah and other women taught culinary techniques, a space for children, and even a small incubator for local micro-entrepreneurs. "Attention, everyone!" Ethan climbed onto the small makeshift stage, holding the microphone with the confidence of someone who had inherited his father's charisma. "Before we start the official ceremony, Jake and I want to say something." Sarah and David exchanged surprised glances. This was definitely not on the agenda. Jake joined his friend on stage, slightly more nervous but equally determined. We wanted to thank everyone who helped build this place, but mainly we wanted to talk about family. A year ago, Jake and I were just school friends, Ethan continued. Today, we are true brothers. And that happened because our parents had the courage to love each other even when everyone said it was strange. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. David discreetly took her hand. My mom always taught me that family isn't just those who share the same blood, Jake said, his voice gaining strength. It's those who stand by your side in tough times. And now I have a huge family. My mom, David, Ethan, Grandma Smith, Mrs. Thompson, and everyone here who has become our chosen family. The audience was visibly moved. Mrs. Thompson, who was in the front row, wiped her eyes without disguise. So, before the adults talk about the center, Ethan said, we just wanted to say, thank you for proving that love is stronger than prejudice, that unity is stronger than differences, and that family is stronger than anything. The applause was spontaneous and warm. Sarah was openly crying now, and David wasn't much better. How smart they are, Grandma Smith whispered proudly. When it was time for the official speeches, David took the stage with Sarah. It was the first time they spoke publicly together, and she still felt nervous under the gaze of hundreds of people. A year ago, David began, I thought I knew everything about social responsibility. I donated money, funded projects, felt like a model citizen. He paused, looking at Sarah. But it was only when I met this extraordinary woman and her vision of community that I learned the difference between charity and social justice. Sarah took the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. When David came into my life, I also thought I knew everything about independence and dignity. I thought accepting help was a sign of weakness. She smiled at him. But I learned that true strength comes from building bridges, not walls. From accepting that we can be different and still be the same. This center, David continued, is not the result of one person's or one company's generosity. It's the result of a community that decided to come together, of families that chose to help each other, of children who taught us that love doesn't understand social class. And that's why, Sarah said, taking a deep breath for what was to come next. We want to make a special announcement today. David smiled, knowing what was coming. Sarah and I are getting married, she announced, her voice clear and firm. And not because our story is a fairy tale, but because it's real, complicated, challenging, and true. The applause was even louder than before. Ethan and Jake jumped on stage. Grandma Smith cried. Tears of joy, and even some of the more serious executives smiled genuinely. But there's one more thing, David said when the noise subsided. Sarah will officially take over the overall coordination of the center, and I will just be another volunteer here, because I learned that real leadership comes from those who understand the community from within, not from those who write checks from the outside. That's when Jake returned to the microphone with one last remark. And Grandma Smith will teach everyone how to make cornbread on Fridays. The collective laughter sealed that moment as one of the happiest in the lives of everyone present. 3 months later, the wedding. The ceremony took place at the Brooklyn Community Center itself, decorated with simple flowers that the women of the community had grown themselves. Sarah wore a simple yet elegant white dress that she had chosen and paid for herself. David wore a suit, but had swapped the Italian tie for one that Jake had made for him at school. "Are you sure you want to get married here?" David asked for the 10th time, while getting ready in the small office that served as a dressing room. "I'm sure I want to marry you in the place where our real story began," Sarah replied from the next room, "and I'm sure I want our chosen family to be here to witness it." Ethan, who was serving as ring-bearer along with Jake, appeared at the door. "Dad, Sarah wants to know if you're nervous." "Very," David admitted. Why? You've practically been living together for months." David laughed. "Because today makes everything official. Today I officially become Jake's stepfather, you officially gain a mother, and we officially become a family." "Dad," Ethan said seriously, "we've been a family for a long time. Today is just the celebration." The ceremony was simple and emotional. Grandma Smith read a passage about love that she had chosen. Mrs. Thompson represented Sarah's family, and the boys exchanged symbolic rings, promising to be brothers forever. When the officiant asked if David accepted Sarah as his wife, he didn't just say yes. He turned to Jake and asked, "Can I also promise to love and protect your son as if he were my own?" Jake, dressed in his best outfit, solemnly replied, "You can, as long as I can call you Dad too." There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. When Sarah promised to love David, she added, "And I promise to love Ethan as I love Jake, because a mother's heart always has room for more love." The reception took place outside, with live music played by local musicians, food made by the women of the community, and a genuine joy that no expensive banquet hall could replicate. "You did it," Grandma Smith said to the newlyweds during the waltz, watching the children run among the guests, mixing business people, community residents, David's employees, and the chosen family they had built. "Did what?" Sarah asked. "Proved that love is stronger than any difference, that family is built by choice, not by chance, and that true happiness comes from building something greater than yourselves." David twirled Sarah on the small makeshift dance floor, watching Ethan teach Jake how to dance, while other couples, rich and poor, young and old, enjoyed themselves together without any embarrassment. "Sarah Johnson, David. Do you have any regrets?" David asked, trying out his new last name. "David Anderson," she replied, having decided to keep Anderson as her second name. "No regrets, just gratitude." "Gratitude? For what?" "For you waiting 2 hours in a restaurant on Christmas Eve, for having the courage to love someone everyone said was unsuitable for you, for teaching me that I deserve to be loved just as I am. And you taught me that true wealth has nothing to do with money in the bank." Ethan and Jake interrupted the romantic waltz, each pulling one of their parents into a silly dance they had just invented. Soon, Mrs. Smith joined in, followed by Mrs. Thompson, and within minutes the whole party was in a big circle, dancing to music that blended samba, foro, and pure joy. As David danced with his family, a word that now included many more people than he had ever imagined, he looked around and realized he had found something that no amount of money could buy. A place where he completely belonged, people who loved him not despite his flaws, but including them, and the certainty that he had built something that would last forever. Sarah, spinning in her husband's arms while watching their children laugh together, finally understood what Mrs. Smith had said months earlier. Sometimes destiny places people in our lives not to complete us, but to teach us that we were already whole all along. The party continued late into the night, with stories being told, plans being made to expand the community center, and promises being made that this chosen family would stay united no matter what the future brought. And when the last song finally played and the final guests left, 2 children, who had once been just best friends at school, fell asleep side by side on the couch, surrounded by a family that had proven that true love knows no barriers, neither of class, nor of time, nor of circumstance. Because some stories are bigger than the people who live them. They are about communities coming together, prejudices being broken, and the simple truth that family is what we build when we choose to love unconditionally.